Today we're going to talk about a battle of a different kind. This is the Battle of Vitoria, and this is really it's not the ultimate final battle in Spain because there's others during the Peninsula War that come after that in the Pyrenees and all that. But how would you classify this battle that took place in 1813?
Well, in a strange way, it is almost the ultimate battle because for the British and the Allies, it completely puts sort of like a period point, a full stop on the French occupation of central Spain, of Spain proper, and it is very close to being a properly decisive victory. And although it is not the last battle, as you say, the political significance of this battle is greater than the battles that follow it in late 1813 and in 1814, even though those battles amidst the Pyrenees and in the passes and then the big slogging match at Toulouse are very important and very dramatic. None of them have the same political consequences as Vitoria, and for that reason, Wellington counted this as one of his greatest battles.
And we have some big names in this one. We have Napoleon's brother, King Joseph. We have Marshal Jourdan. We have your favorite and my favorite, Sir Thomas Graham. We got a lot of fun names in this one. But the battle takes place June 21st, 1813. Really breaks the back of the French war effort in Spain, as we mentioned. But it took the Allies many years to get to this point. If you want to say the Peninsula War started in 1807, you could. If you want to say it started in 1808, you could. So how do we sum up the 5 or 6 years previous to this battle?
Probably with difficulty and very disappointing results, but we can have a crack at it. It is true that you don't need to understand the entire Peninsular War to understand the Battle of Vitoria, but it does give you a much greater depth of understanding if you know what's been happening leading up to this point as to why it is so significant. The Peninsular War, like you say, started, depends when you want to count. Most people will give it an 1808 sort of start point, but you can trace it back as early as 1807, and it is fairly straightforward, to be honest. You have the British landings in Portugal to begin with in 1808. You get the victories of Roliça and Vimiero under Wellesley, as he was then early on. The shameful Convention of Sintra, which allowed the French to return home with all their goodies instead of being destroyed and scattered to the four winds in prison hulks and things like that, which is what the government apparently seemed to want once they figured out what had actually happened. This disappointment was then followed by almost disaster in 1809 at the Battle of Coruña, which occurred after a very famous and brutal retreat from central Spain after Sir John Moore tried to go and support the Spanish armies, only to find that the Spanish armies had been already defeated and he had to get the heck out of there because Napoleon himself was at Madrid with the entire army, and so Moore had to flee back through the mountains of Galicia to the coast, where he fought a battle against Marshal Soult, who he beat the French off but died at the last moment, and therefore was saved the shame of people asking, so how did this happen? And instead became a glorious martyr. So, rocky start. The rest of 1809 goes pretty well, though, because Wellesley comes back, and he kicks the last French out of Portugal under Soult at the Battle of Porto, and then chases him out into Spain. And so the British get a good foothold in Spain, which they retain. But first they have to see off the French counterattack, if you will. 1810, the French return to try and take the border fortresses, and this is Massena is thrown at the British. Massena leads the invasion of Portugal, and he suddenly realizes, I have to actually do work here rather than phoning this in, and he does a fairly creditable job despite criticisms once he actually understands he has to show up for work, he does a fairly good job tactically, but strategically, 1810 is a disaster. Lines of Torres Vedras completely break his strategy in two. Has to get out of Portugal again, retreats. 1811, he shows up to fight. Wellington has to take Almeida, and Massena almost defeats Wellington at Fuentes de Oñoro, but does not quite manage it. Another bruising battle occurs where Beresford takes on Soult and again almost gets beaten. But in Soult's words, the British were completely beaten but did not know it and would not run. So they stuck around. And then comes 1812, the glorious year, where everything is set to kick off. And Wellington invades Spain. He takes Ciudad Rodrigo and he takes Badajoz, the keys of Spain, with massive casualties and infamous consequences for the populations of those towns. But he takes them, storms into Spain. Big, dramatic campaign plays out across the sun-baked central Spanish fields. Marshal Marmont is now here, and he is here to prove himself, and he does an excellent job up until the first mistake he makes, practically speaking, and Wellington pounces on it and completely thrashes him from here and everywhere. In his defense, he wasn't on the field for very long because he got wounded by a shell, took his arm off. Just terrible bad luck for the French at the Battle of Salamanca. And then the British take Madrid after that, and the French are in chaos, reeling backwards, thinking, what are we going to do? Pulling in reinforcements from everywhere they need to. And then Wellington basically gives them a respite because he oversteps himself. He goes to try and mop up everything and then gets sucked into the siege of Burgos, which even he seems surprised at the end. Why was I doing this? Why?
Yeah. I think it goes, I mean, there's not very many criticisms of Wellington. Well, one of them is, why did it take him 5 or 6 years to get the French out of the Peninsula War? And I think it goes back to amateurs talk about tactics and professionals talk about logistics. And I just don't think he had the logistics until 1813 to really make that final push. Does that sound accurate?
Yeah, it does. It's very accurate. Wellington's priorities in the Peninsular War are to do as much damage to the French as possible to liberate Madrid, but up to a certain point, it is the government is not keen on another advance into Spain, remembering what happened to Moore, and so Wellington played a very careful game. He spent 2.5 years just making sure Portugal was secure. Then there was 1812. And if he could have pushed that into some sort of conclusion, he would have. But he quickly figured out after they took Madrid, we can't actually defend Madrid. Nobody can.
Right.
So he immediately got into trouble there, and you get Burgos. So I think you're right. Wellington is absolutely a methodical planner, and he will try to create the atmosphere he needs to work in under circumstances in which he can predict logical outcomes. He doesn't like doing stuff where he doesn't know as many outcomes as possible and isn't prepared. And so you get Burgos, which he wasn't prepared for, but kind of let himself think, maybe I can just pull this off and take another fortress before the end of the season, and he couldn't. He had to retreat, and that was nasty. They've surrendered Madrid. They go all the way back to Badajoz, and things are looking kind of bleak.
Yeah, and the French forces in Spain are also depleted as Napoleon drew many of his units for his ill-fated Russian invasion. So now the new year begins. It's campaigning season again. So how does Wellington begin this operation in 1813?
Well, Wellington has very impressively taken the reverse of Burgos in stride almost. He doesn't seem to think it's as big a deal as everybody else does. He goes right back to planning the next campaign, which is kind of, it's kind of a gutsy move considering it's almost, people compare the retreat from Burgos to the retreat from Corona, and they lose Madrid again. But the situation in 1813 is not the same as it was in 1809.
Yeah.
Like you say, a lot of troops have been pulled out of Spain to go to Central Europe, and by the end of 1812, they're not being pulled to go to Russia. A lot of them are being pulled to shore up Germany. The reason for this is actually because of Burgos. Napoleon has said that Wellington has fled Spain, and he thinks that he won't be able to come back in force again for a while, so he thinks he can take troops out of Spain and send them to Germany, because the big show is going to kick off in 1813 in Germany. Wellington doesn't pay attention to any of this. He's perfectly happy to start planning to go back into Spain, and by I think it's by the early spring, he had set the date of the 1st of May to kick off the campaign. He has 25,000 more troops. He has 2 brigades more of cavalry. He's got new uniforms for them. He has depots set up. He is completely ready to go by the time the campaigning season comes around again. On the other side, the French, they also don't seem to think that Madrid is able to be held, because they get Joseph gets permission to move the court to Valladolid, to Valladolid, not Madrid, and they have reduced numbers, but they don't really seem to think that this is a problem right now, because they also seem to think that Wellington won't poke his head back out of Portugal again. But they're going to be in for a bit of a surprise.
Yeah, indeed. Let's head towards the battle now. Let's talk about the size of each army and the commanders. The total Allied strength appears to be 80 to 90,000 troops, but that's some Spanish, some British, and some Portuguese. And then the French armies have about 60,000 troops. And what I think is also interesting is we know who's in charge, I think, on the Allied side, and that's Wellington. But on the French side, there's King Joseph, there's Marshal Jourdan, there's corps commanders. It doesn't seem like one cohesive guy in charge of kind of running that show.
No, there isn't, and this is a problem that you get a couple of times in Spain, especially when Joseph is involved. It happened at Talavera as well, where Marshal Victor was sort of operationally in command, but the king is there as well, so it's difficult for generals to say that I'm in charge of this army when the king is there. And that's sort of what happens here. You have, technically, the commander-in-chief is Joseph Bonaparte, but the chief of staff is who is Marshal Jourdan, is technically, realistically, the guy in charge. But the army that fights at Vitoria is made up of the remnants of various French, in quotes, armies that have been operating in Spain and Portugal since the beginning of the war. So you don't have a properly united force exactly. You have what you call the Royal Army, for instance, which is sort of Joseph's guard, I guess. You have the Army of Portugal, which is now under command of General Rey. You have the Army of the Centre, which is under Jourdan. And then you have the Army of the South, which is under Gazan. All these guys had independent commands. But of course, as soon as a marshal shows up, he technically takes command, which is what happened in other cases, and is why you get... I guess it is a contributing factor to why French armies are not massively cohesive during the Peninsular War. But why, when you get sort of inspirational leaders showing up like Marmont and stuff like that, they tend to operate very effectively. Or Soult, he's another one who gets them marching well. But they're all over the place over there. But meanwhile, Wellington is in charge. He is the man, and no one else is in charge.
Right, and we'll come back to that point here in a minute about cooperation between the different armies. I do want to talk about the terrain of this battle. which is an interesting feature. Our listeners probably know from previous episodes the topography in Spain is quite rugged, a lot of mountains, it's hard marching. In this battle, the Zadorra River is also a key feature. But is this more of a plain battle, like an open plain, or how would you describe the Vitoria battlefield?
The Vitoria battlefield is fought in a valley, essentially, the widening of a valley, the valley of the Zadorra River. It's very tricky. It's quite compressed as well. It's not a big sweeping battlefield. It is hemmed in on one side by the heights of Puebla, and then you have the Sierra Morales and a couple of sort of prominent hills out to the east as well. And all of these kind of crowd in on the path of the Zadorra River, which runs past Vitoria, which is off to the eastern side of the battlefield, all the way down through a gap in the heights of Puebla. And this river is going to be a massive focal point of the battle, and the floodplains on either side of it in sort of the central battlefield area is also going to be where most of the fighting occurs. But most of the fighting occurs within the limits of the river itself and the heights of Puebla. So it's quite a long battlefield, but it's not very wide.
Mm-hmm. Well, the next part I think is the most intriguing for me, which is the plan for each side. Wellington's plan seems pretty simple. He's driving his troops hard to cut the French army off to prevent them from reaching the relative safety of France. Meanwhile, it seems to me that King Joseph has decided to draw a line in the sand to make one final stand against the British, which I admire his courage. He's like, I'm not going to just give up Spain, without a fight. But then there's also the matter of the long wagon train of loot that the French are slowly sending back to France. And then there's Marshal Jourdan, who tells everyone, no, we shouldn't fight this battle. And he's sick, so he can't even really manage the battle. I mean, there's a lot of planning going on, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Vitoria is the final act of Wellington's pretty masterful 1813 campaign. It's something close to a strategic masterpiece what he pulls off here. He, in total, in Spain, in terms of moving parts, has somewhere between like 90 and 110,000 men. He's never had so many troops under his direct command. He's never had so many guns. He is really well supplied, and he takes advantage of this from the very start. The reason the French get into this terrible position is because he just completely outfoxes them from the start. Hill and Graham are given two divergent missions. It looks like they're separated. Hill goes off to do his usual independent thing and mess around where the French don't like him to be. Meanwhile, Graham takes advantage of that distraction and just pushes most of the army across the frontier. Wellington takes up a kind of a central position between the two, then goes to join Graham. And what happens is that the French take up a series of positions to guard the main road to Valladolid, where the new court is, but they're continually levered out of them because Wellington keeps showing up on their flank, and the French have no idea how he is continually managing to push so many thousands of men and artillery round roads that they couldn't get a donkey down. And at one point, they completely lose track of him for about 4 days. And they have no idea where he is until he shows up again almost in their rear. And again, That means the French army runs for it. And so they get to this nice position around Vitoria. They have a nice big river and they get everybody behind it. This is going to give us some security here. You can't outflank this. We can see him every which way he chooses to come. So this is the kind of the plan here. It's just to consolidate everybody. They have to buy time to consolidate troops. They would like Suchet to come up from the south and get a big force to stop Wellington. And Wellington is delighted by this sudden pause because this allows him to gather his entire force together and prepare to basically turn this fortress that they've created between the heights of Puebla and the Zadorra into their prison, basically.
Right.
There's one road out of here.
And it's clogged, right, with this wagon train of loot, which I guess is like 6 years of stolen money and property, correct?
Yeah, well, the entire royal, like the Bonaparte court that was in Madrid, has moved. It moved from Madrid to Valladolid, and now it's looking like it's probably have to get out of Spain, or at least move much closer to the frontier or something like that. So yeah, this is a problem for the French, and at the second, it looks like a downright bonus for the Allies because it's slowing them down and cutting off their retreat. And Wellington knows more about the French army's movements than the French do at the second, so he's quite confident.
Well, let's jump into the beginning of the battle. It seems the French are kind of strung out haphazardly around Vitoria. Wellington splits his army into 4 attacking columns, including our favorite Sir Thomas Graham, making an envelopment maneuver. Can you kind of talk to us about the beginning of it?
A battle seems to be looming in the days around from the 17th of June onwards, and some of the French are happy about this, and like you say, Jourdan is not happy about this because he's correctly identified that this is basically a tomb we're sitting in right now. If something goes wrong, the entire army is going to get trapped in here.
Right.
Jourdan has a terrible reputation because of Vitoria, and he doesn't deserve it. He was a very good soldier, and he saved the French Republic, famously. But he was sick, and command structure in the French army is now totally down the drain. And everybody's basically going to fight for their own army groups with some sort of vague coherence of supporting each other. And they're going to do this in a series of lines. Like I said, the battlefield is narrow. So the French flanks... So the French front is always facing west, but their flanks curve to the north to guard the many bridges that cross the Zadorra, which would become their right flank, all the way down to Vitoria. Their left flank is anchored on the heights of Puebla. And that doesn't look good optically on a map. It doesn't look good for an army commander to just look at those heights and say, well, we're kind of safe. We can just post nominal amounts of troops up there to guard them. Everything's going to be fine. And that's where everything kicks off.
Yeah, I was looking at a map of it yesterday, and the French corps is just like too spread out. Like they couldn't support each other. They were so far apart.
Yeah, they're stacked up one behind the other. It's nonsense. Wellington gets all his guys, and basically the French also give Wellington time to sort things out. I guess perhaps because they only have one road out and it's kind of clogged at the second. This is probably a big factor for them at the time. And Wellington, has columns set up to hit the French. His plan is very simple. Get the troops across the river, take the river crossings, and outflank them on the heights. The end goal would be to cut off the road out from Vitoria, the road that eventually leads to France. That is the plan for Wellington, and Hill is given the job of starting things off. His guys come up and they attack the heights of Puebla, and they will be fighting there all day, and they will be slowly moving ever onwards across those heights. And during the early stages of the battle, it is kind of Hill that is causing the French anxieties, because he keeps making progress along the heights on their flank, which means that every time he gains another hilltop, they have to pull back again. And so that is kind of the dynamic that is going to be occurring, because they do have this lovely river and very small choke points, villages with bridges on to hold on to as well.
Yeah, it just seems to me that the French aren't able to repel these attacks as they're coming on, and I don't know if it's poor communication or just not enough troops. It also seems the French commanders are reluctant to support each other. I know General Gazan asked Marshal Jourdan for reinforcements, but is rebuffed. I know Gazan fails to cooperate with his fellow corps commander Jourdan. Is the French morale just collapsing as the British are skirting around the flanks, or what's going on here?
It's a bit of that. Definitely. The lack of a supreme commander on the field is also a problem. The fact that you have a bunch of independent guys who have been acting semi-independently with their own army units is similarly problematic. And also there is the morale problem. The French have not been doing well. They have, for the entire summer, they've been running away from Wellington. They remember that last summer they got a good pasting at Salamanca from Wellington. Yep. They know full well that they have not won a victory against Wellington since he showed up. They're not happy about this. And so when stuff goes wrong, it just sort of compounds in every soldier's mind. Well, things are going wrong. We can't do this. Our generals aren't up to the task. I mean, it's no cakewalk for Wellington either. He has a lot of trouble getting his troops across that river. After the initial attack, where Hill makes progress on the heights, he does manage to start getting troops over from the west. But the northern bridges and towns are stubbornly held by the French. And Graham and Picton can't, through delays for setting up and things like that, and because of heavy French resistance, they can't get across the river there. And that is slowing things down inordinately and allowing the French to pull back slowly towards Vitoria. Wellington's nervous about this because it looks like the French might be able to keep walking backwards out of danger, despite their sort of confusion and the fact that the generals aren't working with each other. So it starts getting tense.
I would say, and the optics of it, like if I'm a French private and I'm holding my line, but there's a big wagon train slowly retreating backwards along with other soldiers, I would think, well, maybe we should retreat now. But yeah, maybe they needed a good rear guard commander like Marshal Ney, or someone like that on the scene.
A guy like Ney in this situation would be ideal. A guy who is confident in fighting rear guards. The problem is the French don't really know whether they're retreating or like attacking or like trying to make something of this battle. Right. None of the divisional and army commanders really know what they're doing in this battle. They're kind of on the defensive, which the French really don't like anyway. So Wellington takes the initiative, and they just don't have anywhere to place their intentions. They have no. Yeah. They don't really want to fight here. It's really bad ground for them. As sort of the day rolls on, they could have maybe properly repulsed one of the attacking columns, or maybe like knocked Hill off the heights of Puebla. Maybe then they could have got something going. But no real opportunity arises for them to retake the initiative. It's all Wellington hitting them consistently through the day. And nobody seems to figure out whether or not we just need to like call it here, get a rear guard set up and now get the troops out, or we really need to hit them hard and like try and win this thing or something like that. It's from the French, it's a very lackluster kind of performance, and it could be down to morale.
They're used to attacking the British or the Spanish or the Portuguese or whoever. They're not used to playing this defensive game, so it's probably just a new ball of wax for them. They don't know how to handle it.
Yeah, the French can defend ground. It's one of the big myths of the Peninsular War that the British always defend and the French always attack. But as we can see, the British are quite happy to attack here. So the French should be quite happy to defend. The problem is the ground is terrible to defend. Right. There's nothing to hold you. The river is the only thing that you can hang your hat on, and the heights. And Hill is slowly taking all of the heights, which is a big problem for the French. Eventually, a stalemate occurs, however, because Hill gets held up. Graham can't get across the vital bridge, which would threaten the direct road out of the valley, and Picton does take his bridge, famously swearing at his men as he sort of like he's been delayed, so he's really angry. So he tersely sends a message to the division who's supposed to take the bridge, and tersely sends a message to Wellington saying the same thing, and saying, "I will take it in 10 minutes" or something like that, and then goes bawling across the bridge, swearing at his troops to get across, and they take it. The 3rd Division takes the bridge, but all this does is create exactly. All this does is it creates a stalemate, because the French finally kind of dig their heels in. And Hill can't outflank them at the second because he's also encountered heavy opposition. And Graham is the key. He can't get across his river crossing. It's too well defended at this time. and a huge artillery duel occurs, which is the biggest artillery duel in the Peninsular War. It's about 70 guns, I think, on either side. Mm-hmm. And they sort of pound away at each other while the flanks are working. And this is one of the big sort of memorable moments of the battle. Actually, is this big artillery duel towards just before the crisis of the battle occurs.
It's interesting here. Joseph had to make a decision as his commanders. It's a stalemate now. Should we attack or should we continue retreating back to France? And it seems like they probably made the wrong decision.
Yeah, it's possible. I think by this point, the hope would have been for the French, if we can just maintain this kind of defensive posture until nightfall. And then we can get the baggage away, and then everybody can kind of slip away quietly through the night, is probably the working plan, which could have worked. But by the late afternoon, Wellington has got enough concentration together to really put pressure on the French centre. And as we've said before, the French infantry are not happy about the situation. The French troops are not in a good state of mind to take this sort of punishment. So the centre starts to crumble. And it's one of those dynamic things where a few things go wrong in various points and you try and fix them, but that breaks the other bits. And the flanks
finger
crumble.
in the dam.
Exactly. Then the flanks crumble. And then the centre has to get back. And basically what happens is everything collapses. But essentially what you get is that if Hill is starting to creep further and further across the heights, Graham does get across the river. Massive pressure is on the French centre. And actually the entire army just collapses towards the end of the day. Properly.
Yeah. And it's not an early retreat at all. It turns into a rout. And, we have French artillerymen leaving their cannon. This adds to the clog of retreating soldiers. And two things prevent the utter destruction of the French army. Would you like to talk about those two things? Because one of them is very famous.
Yeah. At this point, Wellington is on the verge of the thing he has been searching for practically since the Battle of Assaye, and even that wasn't properly destructively decisive. He's looking for his Austerlitz moment, and this looks like it's going to be it.
Yep.
He's only lost about 5,000 men. The French army is in chaos in front of him. So what do you do now? You send the cavalry forward. Cavalry crosses the bridges, they go forward, and they go down that road. The infantry press forward as well on the flanks. And at first, it's looking really good. They're capturing prisoners, they're capturing guns, they're chasing off counterattacks. They're going to run this army into the ground, and then they come to Vitoria and they come to its surrounding areas, and they find every road and path is clogged with wagons. At some point, some of the British...
What kind of wagons?
You see, that's the question the British infantry and cavalry started asking themselves. Wow, wagon after wagon after wagon. It's been a hard day. Wonder what's in here. And it's all the treasure. It's the treasury of the Bonaparte regime in Spain. It's all the supplies and food for the army. It's everything the army and the state needs to function. And... that is what saves this broken mess of a French army from utter destruction and deprives Wellington of his Austerlitz.
Yeah, it does. And there's, General Rail's efforts with his two divisions, they cause some havoc in the pursuing Allied ranks. But primarily, I think it is, like you said, it's been a hard day. I'm a British, regular trooper. I don't always get paid on time. Oh, my. A wagon full of silver or gold or diamonds. Maybe I'd take a look in here. It's hard to pass up.
It's like a small trickle that turns into a flood, because as the soldiers pass by, they'll probably just nick a few things out of the wagons as they go. But then it just sort of cumulatively everybody starts doing it. The officers do appear to lose control of their men. Maybe some of them join in themselves. I don't know. But it just becomes impossible to operate effectively as a pursuing force. Riel does obviously do a very good job. He did a good job in 1812 as well, actually. He was a very capable officer, and he took advantage of the situation well. But yeah, the pursuit collapses, does not get really much farther beyond Vitoria, and the French escape, and everybody's rich now.
Right, and we say a lot of money. This is a lot of money. It's estimated that the total amount of gold, silver, and jewels was 1 million pounds at the time, or 100 million pounds in today's money. So it is difficult to blame the soldiers for what they did. But Wellington famously states, quote, "We have in the service the scum of the earth as common soldiers," end quote. Why was he so disgusted at all this?
That very much depends who you ask. It's rooted in his class as well as the situation at hand. He's quite fond of verbally abusing his soldiers. He does not have a great opinion of them as people.
Yeah, it's interesting. He didn't hang out with them like Napoleon did. He didn't really, walk around campfires and have meals with them. He kind of kept his distance.
Completely different command ideas about that. And they're both valid. I mean, people give Wellington a huge amount of criticism for his apparent distaste for his own soldiers. And, you can make that point if you want. If you want a cuddly commander, then that is something that you're not going to appreciate, a cold, distant general like Wellington. But there is a strange honesty to it as well. Napoleon, for instance, is quite cynical about his handling of the troops. He shows himself to his men, and he has these personal touches with them. He has a remarkable ability to remember names, and it seems like he could just remember faces and names with a startling degree of accuracy. Although I'd love to have seen a grenadier say, "No, that's not my name, sire." It would be hilarious if, he just picked names out of the air or something like that, and nobody told him otherwise. But he knew his effect on people. He wasn't really trying to be their friend. He wanted their love and devotion. And in return, he was very callous about how he spent their lives. Now, this is the 19th century, and this is a curving grade. You are expending thousands of lives for square footage, and Wellington lost 5,000 men at Vitoria. That's a lot of men,
right?
But it's not as much as other generals might have used. Wellington's entire thing about the scum of the earth, first of all, is his complete sort of white-hot fury that professional soldiers could lose track of what they were doing there that day so completely. To him, he just couldn't understand how officers, sergeants, all the way down could understand what was important here. And that's the first bit.
He's a duty above all else kind of commander. He's not trying to get money. I mean, maybe glory, but it's easy to say if you already have money, you shouldn't.
I was going to say we stand that Wellington, of course, it has financial security, so that he's not being fair. He's not being fair, and he is being fair. As a soldier, what the soldiers did is complete nonsense. As people in the 19th century who get paid a pittance for what they do, it makes complete sense. And I think, to be honest, because in his more sort of temperate times, he does actually understand. He understands his army much better than we do. For all we raise our eyebrows at the language he used to describe them. These people were not angels. The soldiers of the British Army were there to be paid, and they were there to fight. And they came from many different backgrounds. And they did not come from the upper echelons of society. I'm not going to go around calling people the scum of the earth, but in the 19th century, he may have been warranted to do so in his temper.
Right. But you don't have to be all cuddly to have the soldiers' respect. I know Marshal, most of his troops didn't like him, but they knew he was going to lead them to victory. Same thing with Wellington. Maybe they didn't like the guy, but they knew they were going to win with him.
This is what I was talking about, this strange sort of the slight honesty and slight cynicism between Wellington and Napoleon. Wellington's troops understood exactly where the line was. Right, this is an aristocrat, this is a landowner, and this is the general. The British Army had very strict ideas about sort of hierarchy. You did have slightly more popular, cuddly generals in the 18th century, but Wellington was a new kind of general. Those younger type of generals who are all about the duty, all about the science. I'm not here to be your friend. I'm not going to see any of you again once I retire. I'm here to do the bidding of the government, and I'm going to do it as well as I possibly can. That was Wellington's whole thing. It was a new kind of officer, completely sort of duty-driven, regulation-driven, efficiency-driven. And also Wellington was kind of slightly broken inside. He did not like to show emotion to people. And whenever he did, therefore, show emotion, it usually came out in anger. Because that was the safest one he could show to people.
And he didn't always have the best people skills. We find out later when he's prime minister. He's good as a general. It doesn't mean he's a good politician. It's a different skill set.
But what we can say for certain is the scum of the earth thing he uses a couple of times. It's mostly rooted through Vitoria and his memory of this shocking inefficiency, and then sort of exacerbated by the sort of class prejudices of the time. And then he likes the quip that he's come up with, and he uses it again a couple of times throughout his life, because he'll find a catchy phrase and then he'll sort of repeat it at parties later on. Because he alters it later on in 1814 when he has forgiven the army a little. When he says, we have in our ranks the scum of the earth as common soldiers. It's amazing what good fellows we can make out of them, or something like that.
So he cleans it up a bit.
Yeah. It's like everybody, like we will constantly talk about Napoleon, and we'll constantly talk about how you need to understand more about him before you just accept whatever he says. It's the same with Wellington.
Right.
These people are complicated people, and they say things that we don't quite understand.
Right. And that's why I wanted to have the context there. Like, I mean, if you just look at the quote, you're like, oh, well, why did he say that? That's kind of rude. But like you were saying earlier, this is his Austerlitz. He's about to win his biggest victory in the French escape, and it must have drove him to his wit's end.
Yeah, all of his battles, the biggest battles that he fights, he never actually catches a French army the way Napoleon catches the Allies. And I don't know if that's a driving force, but as a soldier and as a general whose job it is to destroy the enemy, that is his main goal when he comes to the battlefield, especially if he's attacking. He doesn't really mind if they escape if he's like behind a hill. But in the open, he wants to finish the job, and he wasn't able to do so.
Well, let's wrap up. What were the final casualty numbers on each side? I know King Joseph and Jourdan got away, but there were some losses.
Yeah, I think they lost about twice or so what the Allies lost.
Yeah, because I remember Marshal Jourdan finally got out of bed, and he walks into the general's tents, and he said something to the lines of, "Gentlemen, it seems like you had the battle you wanted, and it seems you've lost it." You know, and he basically chastises Joseph and his generals for drawing that line in the sand.
Yeah, I think that the common number that people come up with is around something over 7,000 casualties all told, and the British and Allies lose somewhere between 5 and 6 or something like that. So it's not double. It was fairly even casualties. The reason for that, of course, is because of the nature of the battle it was. It wasn't a battle in which the circumstances allowed higher casualties to be inflicted by one side and that broke them. It was a strategic issue with the French that caused the entire army to, because casualty-wise it must have been going fairly evenly up until a certain point for those casualties to be quite so similar.
Well, artillery duels too. I mean, those can get quite high in casualties.
Oh, yes.
You're hit by cannonballs. That's pretty much it. Let's discuss the legacy of Vitoria. Obviously, it knocks the French out of Spain forever. That's the end of the Spanish Empire for Joseph Bonaparte. Is it in the top 5 or even top 3 of Wellington's victories? Where do you think? What do you think the legacy is, and with the Napoleonic Wars and with Wellington's battles? Because he has many to choose from.
Wellington himself used to count Vitoria in the top 3. That ranking used to change throughout his life, depending sort of how he was feeling. I think that it used to run like his top 5, not quite in order, were something like Waterloo, Vitoria, the Pyrenees.
I think Asai was in there too, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. He also used to count Salamanca, and Asai he did count, but he counted it as one of the. So what happened with Asai was that later on in his life, he was asked at a dinner party what he thought the finest thing he ever did by way of fighting was. And he supposedly thought for a moment and sort of became more sort of distant, as if he was remembering something, and then said the single word, Asai. I don't doubt that he did count it as one of his finest pieces of work, though I think that this was sort of something that had occurred to him later on. And he doesn't count Asai as one of his greatest victories whenever he lists his greatest victories. He said this on one occasion, and this is reported by somebody else. Whereas when he's asked what his greatest victories were, he usually counts the Waterloo and the Spanish ones if he's doing a list, and leaves Asai out.
Right.
Asai was the moment where he became a very famous general. It was sort of like his proving ground. But at the time, he had been worried about it because he had lost a lot of men.
He was at 10-1 odds in that battle.
That's why he thought it was the finest thing he ever did as sort of tactically in terms of fighting, because he managed to make the right calls all the way through the battle on a knife edge, where making one mistake at the point in which he began properly to fight it would probably have meant defeat. And this was in a rapidly changing situation, completely unlike fighting the French. So where it sits, I don't know. Where he thought it sat, probably quite high. But Waterloo and Vitoria, he considered his greatest victories because of the political consequences of them both, rather than as pieces of actual fighting.
And it's interesting, Napoleon's reaction obviously wasn't happy about it, but he still kept Joseph close to him and wanted Joseph near him. And he had no compunction. If you were a brother of his and you weren't making him happy, he'd send you off into exile or put you in some country estate. So he probably wasn't happy with Marshal, Jourdan, or the other generals. It didn't ruin his relationship with Joseph. He kept Joseph close to him.
Yeah, this is true. You can say a lot of things about Napoleon, but one of the things you cannot say about him is that he was not loyal to his family. He was endlessly loyal to his family. In fact, it got him into a great deal of trouble politically because he used to put his brothers, he used to make his brothers king of Spain and things like that, which is just a very dubious idea.
And I read a book once that said, the Bonaparte family, Joseph was the only coward of the bunch. And I find that somewhat disrespectful because he was brave in his own way. It is. He was a good politician. He showed bravery at Vitoria to draw the line in the sand. And even after Waterloo, when Napoleon's trying to flee to the United States, he offers to change places with his brother, which I think shows tremendous bravery because he might have been thrown in jail or whatever, hung for being Napoleon. So I think he gets more flack than he should.
He does. So does Jourdan. And it's all because this is the curse of Wellington on the French army. I make this point quite a lot, actually. All the guys who get sent to Spain to do stuff, to fight Wellington, to hold Spain for Joseph, come out of it with the most tarnished military reputations possible, especially in English language works. People can't understand why Soult was made Chief of Staff in 1815 after all the times he lost in Spain. People basically write Massena off because of 1810 and 1811, despite the fact people thought he was almost as good as Napoleon before that point. Marmont, I mean, people think he's a traitor because of the Ragusade thing.
But Napoleon continued to employ him, even though he lost Salamanca. Yeah.
Absolutely. All of these guys were good soldiers. And Joseph comes in for a lot of criticism mostly because of Napoleon's policies. It was Napoleon's policy to remove the Spanish Bourbons and replace them with Joseph, because he had a vendetta against the Bourbons. So Joseph, who had been doing a good job in Italy, as I think he'd been the King of Naples.
King of Naples, yeah.
Had to go and do the same thing in Spain, and he probably could have if the place wasn't such a bin fire. But
yeah,
the fact he got saddled with this in a situation that he wasn't prepared for, he wasn't a soldier, is not really his fault, and people have been too harsh about Joseph Bonaparte. He's a character of fun, and it's not fair that he should be so.
And the legacy, he couldn't control his marshals or generals. Well, yeah, if they all knew that they could just go around him and ask Napoleon for something, it's very hard for him. They're not
his marshals. I mean, he's there due to the good graces or curse of his brother, and a stronger man, maybe like Lucien, who very sensibly did not take any of the crowns off to his brothers, might have been able to create his own loyalty system here. But all of the generals who come to fight in Spain are officers of the Grande Armée. They're dispatched there.
And it should be pointed out, after Joseph does make it to America, and lives there quite peacefully for a long time, and many generals visit him. He has a lot of French court visit him in America. So clearly, I think he's more respected than a lot of historians give him credit for.
Yeah, there's nothing he could do in Spain. He would have needed to be a completely different person to have taken control in Spain. And Napoleon would have hated it if Joseph became too independent anyway. So, yeah.
Agreed.
This was not the last battle in Spain, legacy-wise. It is famous because it ended in conjunction with problems in Central Europe, the possibility of the French returning to occupy properly Spain, and they retreat to the line of the Ebro River through the Pyrenees.
Yeah, and there's the Pyrenees campaign, which we don't have time for on this podcast, but yeah, it's another campaign in itself. Well, thank you for that, Josh. I think that was a good overview of the Battle of Vitoria. And again, if you guys would like to hear more Josh, which I recommend you do, go to his YouTube channel, Adventures in Historyland, or check out his book, Every Hazard and Fatigue, The Siege of Pensacola. And we thank him as always. Thanks, Josh.
Thank you. It was a great pleasure to be back. And I hope everybody has a good day, night, whatever it is that you're currently in the middle of. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening.